Hello.
One. Hello.
Yeah, we're here. We're live.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Hello, chat.
Thanks for coming on, squad. Hello.
One. Hello. Yes, hello. Here
Yeah,
we
we're
are.
here. We're live.
Hello. Well, hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think we're all good.
Great. Okay, well, let's get to it then. No need to delay. Hello, everyone. I'll start with introductions. My name is Callie. I have my MBA, and for the past 10 years, I've been working with fast growing companies on their business operations and on the finance side of things. And today we are so lucky to have Eden. I'll let him introduce himself.
Hello. Yeah, I'm Eden. I am a software engineer, but now co-founder of ThinkC with Callie. I've worked at Microsoft, Google, and Slack in the past. I've interviewed probably hundreds of engineers from like the intern level all the way up to staff, and have also mentored a lot of new grads and kind of helped people get through the last interview at FAANG.
And that is really why we are here today, and what we want to share with all of you is we're doing this webinar because we've seen so many early stage software engineers make it to the final interview. They think they did well, but they end up without an offer and they don't really know why. And so Eden will be talking about if you're a recent grad with a CS degree, if you did a boot camp, if you're self, or if you're just starting out as a software engineer and you want to work at a big tech or top tech company and you're getting interviews, but you don't know why you're not landing that offer. There are three things that are the most common things, common reasons why. So we'll just let's just start with them. Let's talk about them. No reason to keep everyone waiting. Number one is that you're not asking enough questions in the interview itself. So, Eden, why don't you think new software engineers don't ask enough questions?
Yeah, I think a lot of, especially like new grads or people just out of boot camps, they're so used to working in like a black box almost. Like they have, whether it's homework assignments with very like strict guidelines of like how it exactly should work, that once you get into the interview setting, you're not used to actually like collaborating over it. Like you never talk to your teacher and you're like, what if I do it this way? They're like, no, you do the homework assignment like everyone else, right? So I think it's just kind of like a new muscle you have to flex. And even with leak code practice, you don't really get that. You don't ask
Mhm.
like, how should I solve this? And so I think people, yeah, they come into the interview and they forget that there's a human asking them the question, and they just like dive in almost like as if you weren't there. And I think that's why it's just like not something they've practiced a lot.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's completely different to be studying on your own or practicing solo versus, with somebody. But what happens if you don't ask questions in the interview? What's kind of the consequence of that?
Yeah, good question. Um, what can happen is that you might miss a lot of important parts of answering the question. So I think people underestimate like how much an interviewer wants to help you in the problem. Like people think it's like their professor where it's like you don't get anything or any help. Like you just have to turn it in. Where actually like we're usually really happy to answer questions and talk with it through you to figure out like how we should solve this problem together. So like the problem that happens is, maybe you end up focusing on something that's not actually important, or you like go down a rabbit hole that the interviewer didn't really care about. So it's like you have this free resource right in front of you that's willing to tell you like exactly how we should do this together, but instead it's like you have a free cheat sheet almost, and you're like, I don't need the cheat sheet. I'm just gonna solve it the way I think is right. And it's like, okay, but you could have literally made this 100 times easier if you just asked a few questions. So it's basically
Mm,
like, why are you putting yourself at a disadvantage by not asking those questions? Like the people
mm,
who ask the questions are gonna do better than you and they're gonna get the job. It's kind of as simple as that.
mm. So the interviewer is really expecting you to ask questions and be, sounds like a little more collaborative. You said that you have this resource in front of you, so it's more of a two-way street almost.
Mhm. Yeah,
Mm,
it's like the interviewers, they want you to ask these questions too. And there's been many times where I've interviewed people where I try to push them to have the conversation, but they're just so hyper focused on solving it that they almost like ignore me. Like even if I'm like, "Hey, like what if we do it this way?" They're like, "No, no, no, I got it. I got it." And I'm like, "Okay,
mhm.
well, I'm trying to like tell you how we should do this, but you're ignoring me."
Yeah, I'm trying to help you out. It
Yeah.
can be scary. I mean, any interview, especially when you have your dream company or something that you've been studying and preparing for so long, it can be nerve wracking. So, I mean, why, why is it important for the interviewer to know that this software engineer is curious and wants to be collaborative?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I mean, when we're hiring someone, we're not hiring you to come to the company and like work in isolation. Like software engineering is very collaborative and we have to work together to solve things a lot. And, I have to think about like, do I want to work with this person who is not even willing to talk to me like I like especially in this scenario where it's like they know I have the answer to the question and they aren't even like willing to hear what I have to say. It's like imagine when we're in a workplace scenario when I don't have the answer and I actually need someone to talk it out with. Like,
Mm,
are you actually gonna work with me on this are you not open? Especially at like the new grad intern levels, it's like if you made it this far into the interview, you probably are pretty good at coding because usually the pre-interviews are very difficult. So it's kind of like at this point, I'm kind of testing like how well are you good at collaborating and solving problems with someone else? Um, because when it comes to starting the job and working with you 40 hours a week, I want to know that you're open and willing to talk through problems. Because otherwise, it's going to be honestly a pain in the ass to work with someone who is too stubborn to like ask questions or to work with others.
mm. Yeah, that's a great point. Is during the interview, the interviewer is getting a taste of what it's like to work with you in a real setting. It's not just a test of your knowledge, it's also what would it be like to work with this person. That brings us to number two, which is another big mistake is that early stage engineers tend to over optimize or spend too much time on one question. And I think that goes back to exactly what you're talking about, Eden, where they're operating in kind of a black box scenario where maybe there's one answer, they're just trying to get the answer rather than see it as a collaborative environment. So with that in mind, where do you think most people end up wasting their time in the interview?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, over optimizing is definitely a big one. And yeah, it goes back to like school assignments where you need to have the most optimal solution or you lose points. Like there's almost never a scenario at school where you need to find like the middle most optimized solution. But again, it's like, yeah, we have to go back to collaboration. And it really depends on the company and the interviewer what they're looking for. And sometimes it's not that they're looking for the most optimized solution because sometimes the most optimal one might take way too long and the interviewer's like, you know what, like we only have 30 minutes. We don't need that. I'd rather go over some other stuff. So I think it's important to work with your interviewer to kind of figure out what they're trying to get out of that question. So it like advice I give to a lot of people is to just like ask the interviewer at the beginning, like, is it okay if I start with the least optimal
Mm.
solution or something like that? And again, people forget you can just ask these questions. Instead, they keep it all in their head. They're like, I don't know, like, what do they want? Do they want something super fast? Do they not? And it's like, just ask them.
Mhm.
There's never been a time in like the hundreds of interviews I've done where it's been a negative for someone to ask anything. Like,
Mm.
there have been times where I'm like, I can't tell you that, or like, no, but I've never been like, oh, wow, I can't believe this person asked for help
That's
or asked a question, you know?
that's really good to hear because for people who've never been on the interviewer's side, it is scary. You don't want to look like you don't know what you're talking about or you don't know something because you're trying to impress them.
Hmm.
But again, it sounds like being collaborative is much better than trying to get the most optimal solution.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So it's like, and a lot of times, like, people have come to me and been like, I totally aced that question. I can't, like, I don't know how I didn't pass the interview. And a lot of people don't realize that sometimes, like, interviewers have different levels of questions. I know we talked about this before, where it's like, I will ask like a very simple question to start. And then, depending on how well they do, I'll kind of ask like the level two part of the question. And then, if they do well, I'll do like level three. And if
mm,
they get to the like level three, then I'm like, yes, I'm probably going to say yes to this person to get hired. But if they could only make it to level two, maybe not. So, what happens a lot of times is that people get so caught up on like the first question or the first part of the question, and we don't even have a chance to get to the other ones because they're like, I have to make this part perfect. And it's like,
mm,
and there's so many times I try to dig them out of that hole where I'm like, this is like totally good for now, let's move on. Or like, try to help them and be like, this is good. I want to move on to like another use case. But then they get so scared that the first one isn't good enough that they just keep like doing more and more until they figure out the most optimal solution and they're like, yes, I did it. But in my head, I'm like, well, we didn't even get to the important question, so I can't say yes
mm.
because you wouldn't move on. And I tried to get you to move on, like, and not to say that it's like, like, it's hard, it's stressful, like, it's a lot on the plate for like a 45-minute interview or whatever. And if people aren't practicing this, they don't realize the cues that the interviewer is giving. And yeah, most of the time we're trying to help you out. And if an interviewer says, like, let's move on or let's do something else, it doesn't mean you're like doing bad. It means literally like they're ready to move on to the next thing. Stop optimizing and move. Like, don't get in your rabbit holes because you don't know how much left they have to ask
Mhm.
you, which is probably a lot more.
Yeah, that's a great point. Is that you don't know the full scope of what the interviewer wants to get to. So, but how would you know then if you're spending too much time on one question? How do you know if the interviewer has more to ask or not?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to like you can just ask. Like,
Yeah.
you literally can just be like, are you expecting the most like, because sometimes they are. Like, sometimes you're like, hey, do you need the most optimal solution? And they're like, yes, let's figure that out before moving on. Then like, okay, you're not doing a rabbit hole. This is something you actually need to figure out. So it goes
Mm-hmm.
back just to asking more questions. Um, like, if you feel yourself talking a lot and the interviewer's not saying anything, you can even like go to them and be like, hey, like, should I keep trying to figure out how to make this faster? Or should I just figure out how to solve this? Like, what are you thinking? Uh, yeah, just ask and they'll tell you.
Interesting. So almost like you don't want long, awkward silences during the interview. You
Yeah.
want to be talking. Mm-hmm.
almost the whole time if you can.
Really? Wow. Well, that's good. I mean, that's great to know too, that it's okay to just talk and ask. I think that can be a very intimidating thing when you're in that situation.
Hmm.
Um, well, I'm just gonna say number three then, because I think that this also goes back to the difference between coding by yourself as a student or as an individual, and then coding on a team, which is mistake number three is that during your interview, you don't consider the context of the code. And as someone who's not an engineer myself, Evan, how is coding on a team different than coding while you're studying and coding in isolation?
Yeah, I think like the biggest difference is when you're coding at school, coding for projects, coding on leak code, it's like no one is using this code. It's like being run to test if you did it right, and that's it. Versus real life, especially at FAANG, like Google, Meta, whatever, like your code is going to be used by real humans and probably millions of them, like per second. So you go from like literally zero people using the code to maybe millions. And thinking about that context, especially where you're interviewing, is super important. And especially at the new, like if you're more senior, it's like, okay, yeah, I expect you to have like a pretty in-depth understanding of how to scale stuff. But as a junior engineer or like a new grad, even like mentioning the fact that there's like context to where code is run puts you like way above all the other students because they still are in the like the mindset of like homework assignments, leak code. Even if you like were to say I like asked someone a question and they started to solve it and they asked me something like, oh, like where is this code going to be used? Is this something that's used every day? Is this something that's used hundreds of times a second, millions of
Mhm.
times? Like even ask like I don't expect a new grad to understand how to solve for that, but even asking those kind of questions make me think like, wow, this person is already thinking about like the big picture and the context of these things where all the other new grads that I
Mm,
interviewed before barely could even like hear what I had to say. But this person is thinking about what I have to say and like the context of the code, how it's being run, who's using it.
wow.
And yeah, I think people don't realize that they can bring stuff up that they don't know how to solve, if that
Mhm.
makes sense. Like
Yeah.
you get points for just thinking about things or talking about them. Like just saying like, yeah, I think this code works like say if you came to a solution and you're done being like, yeah, I think this code works well in this scenario, but for example, if you were to have this run like a million times a second, it would totally break and I don't know how to fix
Mhm.
it.
Mhm.
Like that
Mhm.
still is shows me that they have like awareness of how code in the real world is used.
Mhm.
And that's what I expect from like a high performing like new engineer. Yeah, once you're like 10 years into software engineering, I need you to know how to like do that and handle it,
Mhm.
but just even mentioning it as a new engineer is putting you way above pretty much everyone else.
Um, That makes a lot of sense. I mean, just knowing that you can ask those questions to show that you're aware of it, you don't need to have the answer. It's almost like you're proving that you have that mentality and that those considerations are really important. And I'm sure a lot of engineers do wonder that and they do think about that, but maybe they just don't talk about it. They don't voice it in the interview. And then how is the interviewer supposed to know that you're already thinking that? That's a great point. And it seems kind of obvious, but for the interviewer, can you tell that they're inexperienced just by the questions they ask or the questions they don't ask?
Um, by the questions they don't ask, definitely, because like yeah, the more questions you're asking, the more you're collaborating, the more experienced you probably are, whether in interviewing or working with people. Um, yeah, I guess in the context of like new grad interns, the interviews I've done for them, it's very interesting because I feel like they all probably have the same technical level of expertise, and they probably all would do pretty well, like if they started at Google. It's like you already, for most people who get that far, it's like you'll probably figure it out if you joined. But
Mm-hmm.
we can only say yes to so many people. So it's like we will have to favor the ones who can show us more in that 45-minute bout. So it's like, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
if we hired you all, it'd probably be fine, but I need to somehow know that like one person who is extremely quiet and like kind of solved the problem versus another person who solved the problem who's extremely quiet. Then we have a third person who solved it, but they talked to me and they showed me that they like understand context and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Is that person a better engineer? Maybe, maybe not, but I feel more confident saying yes because at least you showed me like a piece of it that you have the potential to
Mm-hmm.
be a conversation person or whatever, you know?
Mm-hmm. That's a great point about most engineers might be at the same technical level, but it's not that's going to set them apart. It's the way that they think and then communicating the way that they think about all these other areas beyond just specific technical ability and technical, quality. Because back to what you mentioned earlier, you're not, you're on a team. It's a very different environment. So there's other people involved. There's other stakeholders involved. You're working in a business environment, not a university or not a study environment. So why, I know you kind of mentioned this already, but just to kind of clarify, why does considering these other stakeholders even matter during the interview?
Yeah. Yeah. Again, yeah, it just totally sets you apart as like a new grad. And especially now it's harder than usual to get a job as a new grad. And so it's like when I mentor like people who are trying to get their first job, like my goal is to make it so they are complete like outliers compared to everyone else because that's the only way you can like really secure a job, especially in FAANG where it's like so fickle, where like you hear so many people who pass even the final round of interview and then they get screwed over because they're like, well, like we actually didn't find a team match, but you can come back in 6 months. Like that happened to me actually when I passed the Google intern interview, but they didn't like team match me or something. So they were like, "Oh, sorry, never mind." And I had to like scramble to find an internship. So it's like even passing the final interview is not good enough to get a role sometimes, which is kind of crazy.
That's
Especially
brutal.
now, I'm hearing it
That's
even more
brutal.
often. Like I passed the final round, but I didn't get a job.
So what?
And they didn't tell me till like 4 months later. So it's like you have to be like an extreme outlier to secure your role. And I think the best way to be an outlier is to interview just extremely, extremely well, which means not only do you have to answer the technical problem, I think what happens is people practice leak code, they grind, and they can
Mm,
solve pretty much any problem, which I do think is for step one, you have to do that. Like we're talking to the people who've already done that. And it's like, okay, how do I stand out against these hundreds or thousands of other people who are interviewing at the Googles or whatever in getting the question right? Like getting the question right is not enough
Mm.
anymore. So if you can be that person to wow that interviewer so much that they're like, holy crap, like this person has to work here versus like, yeah, they're another like good student who did well, same as all the other smart kids who have applied here. It's
Yeah,
like you want to be so good that the interviewer almost is like gonna go out of their way to be like, holy crap, we need this person. And I've like in I don't, again, like the hundreds of people I've interviewed, there's only been like maybe three or four people where I was like, wow, we need to have this person work here. Like, dang,
that's pretty slim. That's
they
pretty
know their stuff.
slim. Yeah.
And yeah, a ton of no's. And even though these people are probably smart enough to get the interview, it's like, okay, but I have to compare you against the other really smart people.
Hmm.
And even a lot of the yeses, it's like, yeah, but I wouldn't be like heartbroken if they didn't join. Like
Mm.
they're really smart. I think they're capable, but there's only a few where I'm like, I think this person would make my team better, not like just
Mm.
be good enough to get by, but actually like you would help me, you know?
Hmm. Yeah. And that way, you, the interviewer, you in this case, are really fighting for them. And that goes a long way because in the interview process, yeah, it's not really enough just to be technically good, technically proficient, even technically impressive. There's a team. You're going to be working with other people in on a business, on something that people use. So that scope is way different. So that's good to. Those are all great things to keep in mind. And I
Yeah.
like the way that you said you want to be an outlier. So being
Yeah.
an outlier in your interview, standing out. So just to wrap up real quick, the three things were number one, not asking enough questions in your interview. There should be no awkward silences, no long pauses. Ask questions. Ask questions about anything when you're in doubt. The interviewer is a person as well, and they can help you. Number two is don't try to over optimize and spend time on one problem or one question unless you've asked them and that's what they want you to do. So it goes
Yeah.
back to number one. And then the third thing is you need, or you, if you're not considering the context of the code, you need to show that you're thinking about how this code will be applied, the problems that will solve users, and prove your mentality is one of an engineer on the team, not just,
Hmm.
you know, a student level. So, I mean, we're just about at half an hour here, so we'll give a few more minutes for any Q&A from the chat or anybody who has just joined us who may have missed something. If there's any questions you want to ask Eden about
Or Callie.
interviewing, or me, that's true. Or you want to know any business, the business side of things and processes. If not, then we do have a few questions that we can ask that we've seen from scanning other YouTube videos, Reddit threads, just some of these pretty common mistakes, common questions. Well, it's I don't see any so in the chat, so I'll ask this very common one. Um, I think a lot of people want to see examples. So, Eden, can you give an example of what it looks like when you make an assumption and you don't ask a question?
Yeah. What is it like? I think like maybe like I give an interview question and someone starts Like if someone starts the problem, like starts coding right away without asking anything, that's usually not a good sign. Um, so it's like, yeah, if you skip talking about the problem and yeah, start coding right away, I'm kind of like, okay, well, how would you know? Like, because normally, like, the questions that we give are like vague-ish because we want you to ask questions or to see, like, it's almost a test in itself, where it's like, are you going to ask me how this exactly will work? Because I didn't say that much about it. So if you start coding right away, that's usually a bad sign. Like,
Interesting.
so yeah, I would stop. Yeah, that's a common example. Almost anyone who starts coding right away is like, it's a good sign that they're probably not gonna do great.
Hmm. You gotta ask questions first.
Hmm.
And wow, very same message over and over. You can hit me over the head 1,000 times. That even stops me. Okay, we did get a question from the chat. So, Eden, you mentioned being able to wow your interviewer beyond just getting the correct code. Can you provide some examples of cases that you were wowed or how another interviewer might be wowed? Kind of looking for that outlier, how to be that
Hmm.
outlier, it sounds like.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, it definitely depends on the level of the person um, being interviewed. So I don't know, Juan, if you were like thinking of a certain level, but for like new, like more junior engineers, I think it's definitely definitely like the context of the problem, like asking about like who's going to be using this, like how should we scale this, like thinking past actually solving the problem or even being like, yeah, this is solved for this case, like this would work really well if it was only run like once every hour, but it would start to break if it was run like 10 times. And in theory, if that happened, like we would probably need to move it to like make it asynchronous or, like I wouldn't be able to do that now, but just thinking about like the actual application of this, um, that would make me think like, oh wow, like that just solving the problem is not enough and that we really do need to think about the context of the entire problem. And that the thing is like I've talked to Callie about this before where it's like you kind of want to use the bias of the interviewer to your advantage. Like one of the tricks I used to do when I was interviewing is I would kind of like spew every like category of things. I'd be like, oh, we need a test for this, or we need to scale this. And you like wait until the interviewer is like, oh, scaling, or like, oh, testing. Cause like every engineer has a bias towards like something. Like they really are obsessed with testing or really obsessed with scaling or things like that, or making things faster. So you kind of find find that thing that they seem to like care about and you spend like a few minutes talking about that and they get really excited because they're like, oh yes, like I feel like I'm talking to like a great coworker, because a lot of engineers, they love like getting really deep into how do we solve this, how do we solve that, and if you're making them feel that way, like that it feels like fun almost to interview you, like that's taking you to the next level. Because to be honest, like a lot of interviewers don't like interviewing, like as bad as it sounds, like because a lot of times you're like, especially at like companies like Google, it's like they interview so many people. When I was there, I had to sometimes I would interview people like 3 times a week. That's like 3 hours plus like a couple hours of writing feedback, blah blah blah. So it's like really exhausting. So it's like you, unfortunately, a lot of people are like go into these interviews already like, okay, I'm about to talk to someone who like doesn't really want to talk to me probably. They're like super nervous and I'm going to like try to help and they're going to ignore me. So like if you change it so they come out of that interview feeling like, wow, I enjoyed that. Like I love talking about like testing weird cases and this person, like we had a great conversation about that. That was awesome. And it's going to be different for each interviewer. Like I distinctly remember my like Google interview, like one guy was like super, it was like a graph problem I had, and we were talking about like how Google search like scales graphing and all. Like I have no idea how to do that, but I was like talking to him about it, like, oh, like, what if this
Mhm.
many people are searching at the same time? And like afterwards the guy was like, oh, like let me join your like Google lunch. Like this was so fun to talk about this stuff. And it's like I don't even know what that is, but I knew he was excited about it, so I'm gonna talk about it. So
That's
kind
a
of a
great
long-winded answer, but
I love that. That's kind of like a psychological hack where you're just saying what their favorite words are and finding what it is until they respond and they kind of light up. That's a really good hack. All right, we got another question here in the chat. How can I best replicate a technical interview setting when studying leak code by myself?
hmm,
Can be
good
tricky.
question. Yeah, I think you can replicate a lot of the like question asking part. So like leak code, I guess there's like some at the end of the questions where they give you some like help with the assumptions where they tell you like what the input will be, but imagine that you are at like, write down the questions that you would ask the interviewer if you were asked that. So say like for example, if you had a leak code question that was like, I don't know, like you have a graph of these numbers and you need to sort them well, or I don't know, some dumb leak code question. And so say you have it and then like instead of going straight into the leak code, like even with a notebook or whatever, be like, okay, who's going to be using this function? Is it like a public API? Is it something we're using internally? It like what kind of input are we getting? Can we assume that all the input is valid input, or do we have to handle like weird scenarios where they're passing in bad stuff, blah blah blah. Like
Mm.
even though the like leak code doesn't have any of those things because real people aren't running your code, but just assume that they would be and ask those questions. Like, especially if you worked as an intern and have experience or at a, full-time job and you have experience writing code that real people use. Like think of the times that it's broken or things at the time it hasn't worked and why it hasn't worked and use those to help like drive the questions in your like the questions you're going to ask.
Mm.
If that makes sense.
I mean, it makes sense to me as far as thinking of it as a code that's being used in real life, not just a code that's an exercise. It's not just practice, it's applied to a real scenario, a real, problem that's being solved. Um,
Yeah, and in
okay.
leak code questions, I definitely like I think the over optimization thing is common. I've noticed when people are leak coding. So you can practice that too. Like before you dive into like I think people get in their head, they see the question and they're like, "Oh, this is probably a sorting algorithm. Let me do that." Or like, "Oh, this sounds like this. Let me do that." Like just take a step back and be like, "What is the like worst way I could solve this problem?" Like as long as you have a way to solve it first, optimize later. Because a lot of people get stuck and they're like, "Oh, I have to make this super fast." And I'm like, "It doesn't matter if it's fast if it doesn't even work, like make something work first and optimize later is probably a big thing for leak code practice.
Make it work first and then optimize later. It's a good one. Okay. Another question. This is more about the how to respond. Stephanie asks, what do you think of the star response structure? Any other suggestions? And for context here, the STAR method is when you ask a behavioral question, something like, tell me about a time, we've all heard that. It's STAR, situation, task, action, and result.
Mhm.
So, what do you, as an interviewer, what do you think about that? And when people use that structure? to answer those open-ended behavioral questions.
I've never heard of STAR before. Situation, task, action, result.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
It's
so the question is, what do I think about it?
mhm. Or any other suggestions.
Yeah, so I guess like when I also have done behavioral interviews at Slack. So I guess like what do I expect from people's answers? Yeah, again, it depends on the level of the engineer, what I'm expecting. But yeah, I want to know what the situation was, what you did about it. Yeah, what the situation was, what you did about it. And I mean, that's honestly it. I guess like one example is at Slack, we always ask people like, what is the biggest bug or outage you've ever caused? And what, like, at least for me, when I hear the answer, there's like a couple things I'm looking for is one, I don't want to see you like blaming any individuals that a bug happened. Like, oh, I fixed this bug because like some dumb engineer broke something. Like, so
Mm-hmm.
I'm like looking for like red flags also. Like, are you blaming a specific person instead of the actual like system? And then I'm also seeing like, are you taking ownership of it at all? Like, if something you did break, are you doing something afterwards to make sure it doesn't happen again? Are you doing anything to fix it? Or are you just kind of like, yeah, I broke it. That's it. And like, depending on your level, I expect more and more out of your like resolution. So like at a super junior level, I expect you to at least like communicate with someone and be like, "Hey, I think I broke something," like and maybe help them try to fix
Mm-hmm.
it. Next level is um you fix it and like then communicate. Next level is you create a system that prevents it from ever happening again to someone else. Level above that is like you create a system or a process for multiple teams that prevent that from ever happening. So I honestly don't know that much about Star, but I'm kind of like, okay, what happened and what did you do about it? And depending on your level, I expect what you do about it to be more and more advanced. So like junior
Mm-hmm.
level is like you told someone, and the most senior level is you fixed it and prevented it from happening. It created a system to prevent another person from doing it on accident again. And then watching out for red flags, like the same thing with the whole like tell me about a time. It's like, are you bashing someone else? Probably not
Mm-hmm.
great. Like you'd be surprised how many people in interviews are like, yeah, I had to like I never make any mistakes. I always have to fix other people's stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Or like, yeah, this person like never listens to me and I just give up. It's like, oh, okay. Like
Mm-hmm.
if you're bashing people in an interview setting, I don't really know how
Yeah,
nice
it's
you
kind
would
of
be
a
here.
major red flag. Not taking responsibility, especially, and there's lots of other examples you could probably use for this
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, I don't know if
So,
that answers that's I honestly never heard of Star before, but as long as you're like making it super clear what the situation was and what you did to resolve it, I feel like that's enough.
I mean, it sounds like that the STAR framework is very useful and is very helpful. It's just a
Hmm.
matter of knowing what level you're interviewing for and then how your action and result, how well that aligns with the level that you're
Hmm.
aspiring for. So, STAR method, it's a
Yes.
good one.
Good. Yeah, and it definitely is harder the higher level you go because sometimes I'll interview for like staff positions and their answer is very like junior and who knows, maybe they just don't know what I'm looking for. And sometimes I have to push for that, but that's a whole nother topic.
Well, going into another topic, here's another question. It's kind of a tough one. So, Juan asks, how do you handle interviewers that aren't conducting the interview in a collaborative manner? I've had interviewers that seem disconnected or unwilling to help when I ask questions.
Yeah, that's a good one. Because like we were talking about earlier, like unfortunately a lot of like interviewers aren't opting into interviewing. Like they have to as a part of their job. And so sometimes you end up with like a super shitty interviewer and who's not collaborative. And I think in that sense, it's like it goes back to like you do have to be super technically strong, like is the first step. And if the person's not willing to answer your questions, like I've had interviewers like that, and it's like you literally just have to have the conversation with yourself almost. Or I'll be like, if they're not helping you with assumptions and things like that, I will literally like, on the whiteboard or whatever it is, be like, okay, like, like ask the question, be like, oh, who's gonna use this, blah blah blah, and they're like, I don't know, just like solve it. And you're like, okay, well, I'm gonna assume that this is used for like this type of person, and I'm gonna make this assumption like this. And it's like maybe they'll throw that away, but like if they're not gonna give me anything, I'm like, I'm just gonna have this nice conversation with myself. And it's like you do have to, like, again, this goes to the people who are making it to the final round, so your like technical skills are probably really strong. And if this is the type of person that's like not going to talk to you, be like, all right, I'm just going to talk to myself and solve this the best I can. And maybe they're just looking for a correct answer, so I'm just going to try to get to that as fast as I can if that's what they care about. And move on. Like it
Mhm.
sucks, but
You still have to show it. You still have to demonstrate it with me, myself, and I.
yeah. It's like, yeah, it goes back to like every interviewer has a bias. A good
Mhm.
collaborative one maybe has a bias to having certain conversations. Maybe someone like this has a bias towards like just having the right answer that they have in their notebook or something.
Mhm.
I don't know. So it's like, okay, well, if they just want me to solve without talking that much, then I will just talk out loud what I'm thinking, solve the problem. And then they'll probably answer questions like, if you're like, does this need to be more efficient? Yes or no? Like you could just ask them quick, like yes or no things. Um, and if it's really, really bad, like they're kind of an asshole, I would honestly like, you could definitely use your recruiter as a resource. And if it doesn't go well, just be like, hey, thanks for the opportunity to interview, but I just like didn't have a great experience with this interviewer. Can I have
Mhm.
another chance with someone who is not mean? It's-
Mhm.
like especially at a big company, it's like I feel like they're usually more likely to do that. And I've done that before too, where I've like not done well in an interview and I just felt like it wasn't going well with the interviewer, like they almost were trying to like sabotage me or like maybe
Mhm.
they were having a really rough day. And I've definitely done that before where I go to the
Yeah.
recruiter, especially if you do it right after and not like waiting until you get the rejection.
Mhm.
If you do it
That's
like right after and you're like, hey, thank you for getting me this far, blah, blah, blah. But I have to be honest, I really did not feel great interviewing with this person. Is it possible to like ignore this interview and then
mhm.
try again? So, like, be like, oh, even if they passed me, can we just ignore it and do
Mhm.
another one? So it doesn't sound like you're just doing it because you failed the interview, but it's like legitimately I did not have a good experience. Can I
Mhm.
interview with someone else?
Mhm.
Some will be open. I've had
Yeah.
one that said yes to me and like canceled the other interview and gave me another one.
Wow. I mean, that brings up a whole nother topic that we can go off on rabbit trail about, but the whole interview process and the structure of it, and me having been on the business, on the company side of it, where I'm setting up interview loops. I don't even know what this person can technically do. I've just been saying, okay, this person needs to interview this person. So it's more just a matter of filling seats sometimes, which is unfortunately true.
Hmm.
But I mean, that's great advice that you as a candidate can still give that feedback to the recruiter.
Hmm.
And, if you're not working with a recruiter, if they don't have a recruiter, give it back, give that feedback to somebody because also at the end of the day, you don't want that to count against you. And could be they having a bad day, could be maybe they are out to, there's some resentment, whatever it is. But um, as a candidate, you can speak up. There's more than just the one person interviewing you. There's a whole team behind them. There's a whole loop, and they should also know, if it's to their benefit that their interviewers are getting quality, or are conducting quality interviews, because
Hmm.
otherwise you don't want to let go of good candidates. You want to get weaker or poor candidates to slip through. So
Hmm.
that's great. More speaking up, more talking about, you know, as a candidate, you have, I think, more power, more influence, or at least more um, autonomy in the
Hmm.
process. You're not so passive. Anyway, that's my little spiel from the business side, because I always want people to speak up about
Yeah.
their experiences too. So, okay.
Yeah, chances
We've
are you
got,
aren't the only one too that are being kind of screwed over by someone who's like that.
mhm,
But yeah,
yep,
whole nother
that's true.
conversation.
I'm telling you. Yeah. Which, I mean, if we can do more lives, it sounds like there's been some support from Jens and Jonah about doing a mock interview to see what a realistic technical question or more conversational interview question would look like.
Mm,
So that would be very useful.
add it to the
I
roster.
mean, yeah, maybe we could do another live and talk about that, do a mock interview, and maybe go in depth about some things.
Yeah, whatever the
But
boss says.
where's the boss? Just kidding. Just kidding. Eden's the boss. Um, well, if there are any more questions, then if there aren't any more questions, then I think we can just about wrap it up. We didn't really have a time length that we were expecting. So I think it's great that it has gone this long. I thank you all so much who had questions and who gave feedback in the chat. We want this to be useful, and the only way it's useful is if people are actually watching and engaging in it. So thank you for being here. We talked a lot about what not to do and the mistakes to make, and we'll put some more information out there. But I do want to mention that if you want to learn more about the right things to ask, what you should be doing, and if you want personal attention and personal advice, then we are putting together a course for this exact topic: how to interview for top tier tech company as an early career engineer wanting to break in. So I'll put, oh, Eden already did. Eden put the link in the chat. If you want to sign up right now, it's just a wait list. So we don't have dates set. This is more explorative. Again, we are very interested in what's actually useful to you, who is interested, when it will work out. So just please join the wait list. Send it to any of your friends or anybody you know would find it helpful, because we need to know what the people want. So thank you most of all, Eden, for your expertise and your insights and everything that you've shared today. Any closing comments or thoughts from you? Oh,
Oops, I
wait,
was
I
muted.
can't hear. Okay. Is this me? Mute?
Um,
Okay.
yeah, I wanted thanks for being a great host, Callie, and thanks for the squad for coming and watching and asking questions. Yeah, check out the course or email us. I guess I can post my email too. And then there's Callie at Thinksy. Yeah, email us if you have questions, suggestions. Um, yeah, I think mock interview is a good idea. It's definitely a part of like the course, but maybe that could be a nice little sneak peek into the full
Yeah.
course.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
All right, I guess that's it.
Okay. Yes. Thank you. Thank you all for joining. Hope to see you on the next live if we do this again.
Yeah.
Let's
All
see.
right,
Who knows?
y'all.